21 days underground. No sunlight, no phone signal, no contact with anyone I loved. The subway maintenance tunnels beneath lower Manhattan became my world when the outbreak turned the surface into something I wasn't ready to face. I knew those tunnels better than anyone alive. 22 years of maintaining them gave me that. I knew where to seal myself. I knew where the old Cold War blast doors still worked. I thought that knowledge was enough. Then on day 11, someone knocked on a door I'd welded shut. A living person, coherent, asking to be let in. And I had to decide whether the sound of another human voice was worth the risk that he might not be entirely human anymore. What I didn't know, what I couldn't have known, was that letting him in would change everything. Not just for me, but for every survivor hiding in the tunnels beneath us. Because something was pulsing deep under the city, and he was the only one who could hear it. And by the time I understood what that meant, I was 80 feet up a ventilation shaft with a dead waking below me and a man I'd trusted making a choice I still can't fully explain. Let me take you back to where it started. The first thing you learn about living underground is that silence has weight. It presses against your ears like water, fills the spaces between your thoughts until you start hearing things that aren't there. Or things that are there and shouldn't be. I'd been in the tunnel system beneath Fulton Street for 11 days when I heard the tapping. Not the random settling of old infrastructure, not water moving through corroded pipes. This was rhythmic, deliberate, coming from the other side of a maintenance door I'd welded shut on day 3. 3 taps, pause, 3 taps, pause, 3 taps. The pattern of someone asking to be let in. My name is Garrett Solen. I'm 47 years old. For 22 years, I worked as a transit maintenance supervisor for the MTA, which means I know these tunnels the way most people know their own kitchen. Every junction box, every drainage channel, every ventilation shaft that connects to the surface. I know which sections flood during heavy rain and which stay bone dry in a hurricane. I know where the old Cold War era blast doors still function and where they rusted open decades ago. That knowledge kept me alive when Manhattan fell apart above my head. But knowledge has limits. It tells you where to hide. It doesn't tell you who to trust when someone knocks on your door in the dark. And you can't see their eyes. And you don't know if the thing on the other side still thinks like a person. Let me go back to the beginning. Not day 1 of the outbreak. Everyone knows that story by now, or their version of it. I mean, my day 1. The afternoon I made the decision that would define everything that came after. It was a Thursday, October 9th. I remember because my daughter Celia had texted me that morning asking if I'd finished the birdhouse we'd been building together over the previous 3 weekends. She was 23, lived in Astoria, worked at a physical therapy clinic. The birdhouse was an excuse to spend time together, something her mother had suggested before the divorce. And we'd kept doing it after because neither of us wanted to be the one to say it felt strange now. I'd told her I still needed to sand the roof pieces. That was the last normal thing I said to anyone. By 2 in the afternoon, the alerts started coming through on our radios. Not the public emergency broadcasts, those came later. The internal MTA communications. A train had stopped between stations on the A line. The driver was unresponsive. Then a second train, the F, same thing. Then reports of passengers forcing emergency exits in 3 separate stations. And then the word that changes everything. Containment. I was in the maintenance corridor beneath Chambers Street when my supervisor, a man named Ike Petrosian, called over the radio and said 6 words I'll never forget. Garrett, do not go topside, understand? Ike was not a man who panicked. He'd been running transit operations for 30 years. He'd worked through blackouts, floods, the aftermath of attacks. His voice had the same flat steadiness it always did, except for one thing He was breathing too fast. I could hear his lungs working between the words. I asked him what was happening. I don't have time to explain it right. Just get yourself sealed somewhere defensible. Use the old maintenance bay at Fulton if you can reach it. Lock the blast doors. Don't open them for anyone you can't visually confirm is clean. Clean of what? The radio went to static. Not the kind where someone releases the button. The kind where the signal dies mid-transmission. I stood in that corridor for maybe 10 seconds, listening to nothing. Then I started moving. The maintenance bay at Fulton Street is something most people don't know exists. It's a relic from the 1960s, built during the same paranoid era that produced fallout shelters in elementary school basements. The MTA repurposed it over the decades as storage, equipment servicing, a break room for overnight crews. But the bones of it were still Cold War engineering. Reinforced concrete walls 3 feet thick. 2 blast doors, one at each end of the main corridor, operable by manual crank if power failed. A ventilation system with its own filtration that drew air from 4 different shafts. So if one was compromised, you could seal it and still breathe. I knew this place intimately. I'd supervised repairs there dozens of times. I had keys to every interior door, knew the electrical panels by heart, knew exactly which junction connected to city water and which ran to the old emergency cistern that held maybe 400 gallons. Getting there took me 40 minutes. Normally it would have been 15, but I went careful. The tunnels were wrong already. I could feel it before I could name it. The air pressure had shifted, which meant doors somewhere above me were open that shouldn't be. I heard sounds echoing from directions I couldn't place. Not screaming exactly, but something worse. The kind of vocalization that sounded like someone trying to scream through a throat that no longer worked correctly. I didn't see anyone on that first transit. Not alive, not dead, not whatever the third thing was. I just heard them, distantly, and I moved the other way every time. When I reached the maintenance bay, I cranked the primary blast door shut. The mechanism resisted. It hadn't been operated in years, but it moved. Steel ground against steel with a sound like a ship groaning in heavy seas. When it sealed, the noise from the tunnels cut to nothing. Just the hum of the emergency lighting and my own breathing. I spent the first 3 hours taking inventory. Old habits from decades of maintenance work. You assess what you have before you decide what you need. The bay had 2 main chambers and 6 smaller rooms branching off a central corridor. Emergency lighting ran on a battery backup that would last maybe 72 hours at current draw. There was a tool room with welding equipment, cutting torches, heavy wrenches. A storage area with some bottled water, not much. Maybe 30 bottles someone had left from a work crew months ago. No food to speak of. Some first aid supplies in a metal cabinet, mostly expired. The water cistern was my real lifeline. I checked it that first night and found it about 3/4 full. The feed line from the city main was still pressurized, which surprised me. It meant the surface infrastructure hadn't completely failed yet. I filled every container I could find, just in case. Sleep came in fragments. Not because of noise, the bay was silent enough to make your ears ring. Because my mind wouldn't stop calculating. Water, manageable for now. Food, critical within days. Power, 72 hours on backup, then darkness, unless I could tap into the tunnel's electrical grid. Communication. My radio was dead. My phone had no signal this deep underground. And the bay's old emergency telephone line produced nothing but a dial tone that went nowhere. And Celia. My mind kept circling back to her. To Astoria, to the bridge she would have needed to cross to get to Manhattan, or the tunnel she'd need to reach Queens. I didn't know what was happening up there. I didn't know if she'd gotten to safety or if there was any safety to get to. On the second day, I found something that changed my calculations. Behind a locked panel in the tool room, a panel I'd opened maybe twice in my entire career, there was a junction box connecting to the emergency power grid for the tunnel segment, not the main grid. A separate line, installed during the original construction, meant to power blast door mechanisms and ventilation in the event of a nuclear attack. It drew from a source I'd always assumed was a dedicated generator somewhere deeper in the system, but I'd never traced it. The line was live. Whatever fed it was still running. I spent 6 hours rerouting power from that line into the bay's lighting and ventilation system. When I switched it over, and the lights steadied to full brightness instead of the dim amber of battery backup, I felt something unclench in my chest that I hadn't realized was tight. That power gave me options. It meant the ventilation would run indefinitely. It meant I could use the welding equipment. It meant I could maintain a perimeter. On day 3, I welded shut the secondary blast door at the corridor's far end and 3 smaller maintenance hatches that connected to adjacent tunnel segments. I left only the primary blast door operable my one way in or out, and I reinforced it with a steel plate from the tool room stock. By then, I'd heard enough through the walls to understand what was happening in the tunnels beyond. Movement. Not the careful movement of survivors. Something shuffling, irregular, sometimes stopping for long periods, and then resuming with sudden urgency. I heard impacts against walls, against doors. The sounds carried strangely through concrete and steel, distorted into something you had to work to interpret. I didn't open the blast door. I told myself I was being strategic, conserving position. I told myself there would be time to go out for supplies once I understood the pattern of whatever was moving out there. The truth was simpler. I was not ready to see it. By day 5, hunger made the decision for me. 30 bottles of water and 0 food meant I had to move. The tunnel system connected to several stations, and stations had vending machines, storage rooms, sometimes small retail spaces. I knew the routes. I knew which passages should be clear and which were likely compromised based on the sounds I'd been mapping through the walls. I took a welding torch, a heavy wrench, and a headlamp. I cranked the blast door open just enough to slip through, then pulled it almost shut behind me, leaving just enough gap to get my fingers in when I returned. The tunnel was dark. Not the working darkness of a system with emergency lighting, true dark, the kind that swallows your headlamp beam within 30 feet. The air was different, cooler than it should have been, and carrying a smell I can only describe as organic decay mixed with something chemical, something that burned the back of my throat faintly. I moved south toward the Fulton Street station platform. 200 yards of tunnel. I knew every cable tray, every drainage grate, every recessed service alcove along that stretch. I moved slowly, keeping my breathing controlled, stopping every 20 steps to listen. I heard nothing until I was within 50 yards of the platform. Then I heard breathing. Not mine. Something slow and wet, with a rattle at the bottom of each exhale like fluid in places fluid shouldn't be. I killed my headlamp and pressed against the tunnel wall. The darkness was total. I stood there for what must have been 3 minutes, listening to that breathing. It was stationary. Somewhere on the platform above the track level, maybe near the turnstiles. One source, just one. I moved forward in the dark. I'd walked this stretch enough times to navigate by touch my hand on the tunnel wall, counting the cable brackets as distance markers. When I reached the platform edge, I stayed low in the track bed and moved along it until I found the service ladder 40 feet east of the breathing sound. I climbed onto the platform in silence. In the dark, I could feel the space around me, the height of the vaulted ceiling, the open area of the mezzanine above. And I could still hear that breathing, closer now, maybe 20 feet to my left. I needed what was in the vending machines in the employee break room behind the ticketing area. To reach them, I'd have to pass whatever was making that sound. I moved on my hands and knees. Slow. The concrete was cold and gritty. My wrench was in my right hand. I passed a trash can, a bench, the edge of a tile column. The breathing was to my left now. And something else, a smell, concentrated and wrong, like meat left in the sun, but with an undertone of something sweeter that made my stomach lurch. I didn't turn on my light. I moved past it. Whatever it was, it didn't react to my passage. Either it was dormant, or whatever sense it used to detect prey wasn't triggered by slow, quiet movement. The break room door was unlocked. I slipped inside, closed it silently, and only then turned on my headlamp. Jackpot, in a limited sense. Vending machine with maybe 40 items still inside. Chips, candy bars, crackers, nuts. A mini fridge that had lost power days ago, but still held sealed bottles of juice and soda. A cabinet with instant coffee, sugar packets, some canned soup. Not luxury, but survival. I loaded everything I could carry into a maintenance bag I found in the closet. Probably 40 pounds of food and drink. Enough for 2 weeks if I rationed carefully. Getting back was harder with the weight. I went the same way, dark, slow, hands and knees where the platform was concerned. The breathing was still there. Still stationary. Still that wet, damaged rattle. I made it back to the maintenance bay, sealed the blast door, and sat on the concrete floor eating peanut butter crackers with shaking hands. Not fear exactly, adrenaline dump. The recognition that what I'd passed in the dark was not something I wanted to see, and that seeing it might change something in me that I needed to keep intact. The tapping started on day 11. I'd settled into a rhythm by then. Rationed food, careful water management, twice daily checks of the ventilation system. Long hours of silence spent either maintaining equipment or sitting with my thoughts. I'd started keeping a log, scratching notes into a maintenance clipboard with a pencil. Times I heard movement in the tunnel. Duration, patterns. The sounds were irregular, but I was starting to see clusters. Activity seemed to spike in waves, then go quiet for hours. 3 taps, pause, 3 taps, pause, 3 taps, coming from the secondary blast door, the one I'd welded shut. I sat perfectly still and listened. The pattern repeated 4 times, then stopped. 30 seconds of silence. Then a voice. I know someone's in there. I can see the light under the door. Male, young, maybe 20s. Hoarse, like he'd been breathing bad air for days. But coherent, rational, not the broken vocalization I'd heard from the things in the tunnel. My name is Orin Vasquez. I was an electrician's apprentice with Local 3. I have my union card if you need to see it. A pause. A sound that might have been a laugh, but came out as a cough. I know that sounds stupid, but I don't know what else to prove I'm normal. I didn't answer. I stood at the welded door and put my hand flat against the steel. It was cold. No vibration. Just the faint sound of his breathing on the other side, rapid and shallow. Please, I've been in the tunnels for 3 days. I found a way down from the Fulton Street platform. I don't have water. I don't have a light. I've been navigating by wall contact. If you're the kind of person who listens to stories like this late at night, let me ask you, what would you have done at that welded door? Stay with the channel, because the answer I chose is the one I'm still paying for. I didn't answer him that day. I sat on the other side of that door for an hour listening to him talk. He told me about himself in fragments, 26 years old. Grew up in Sunset Park. Mother was a school custodian. He'd been running cable in a sub-basement on Church Street when everything went wrong. His supervisor had been attacked in the stairwell. He'd barricaded himself in a mechanical room for 2 days before finding an access point into the transit tunnels. He'd been walking in the dark since then, following rail lines, trying to find somewhere sealed and lit. He was articulate, scared but functional. Nothing in his voice suggested infection, whatever that would even sound like. But I'd heard Ike's last words don't open for anyone you can't visually confirm is clean. I couldn't see him through a welded steel door. "I'm going to come back," I finally said. "Tomorrow. I need to think." "Think fast, man." His voice cracked slightly. "I'm not doing well down here." That night, I barely slept. I kept running scenarios. If he was clean, turning him away might kill him. If he wasn't, if whatever had taken his supervisor was in him, dormant, waiting then letting him in killed us both. I had no way to test, no information about what infection looked like in its early stages, no communication with anyone who might know. But I knew something else. 11 days alone in silence was doing something to me that I could feel but not name. The walls felt closer every morning. My own thoughts had started to loop, circling the same fears, the same calculations, the same image of Celia standing in her apartment in Astoria, wondering why I hadn't called. I needed another human being in here. Not just for practical reasons. 2 people can hold watch, can divide labor, can problem solve together. For something less tangible. For the sound of another voice that wasn't my own, echoing off concrete. The next morning, I cut the weld on the secondary door. It took 3 hours with the torch, working carefully to preserve the door's ability to reseal. When I finally swung it open, Orin Vasquez was sitting on the tunnel floor with his back against the opposite wall, squinting against the light that poured out of the bay. He looked terrible. Gaunt, dehydrated, filthy, but human. His eyes tracked normally. His skin was pale, but not the gray-green I'd caught glimpses of in my headlamp during the supply run. He held up his hands when I appeared, not in surrender, exactly, but showing me he was unarmed, showing me his fingers weren't curled or locked the way I'd heard described in the emergency broadcasts before they stopped. "Union card," he said, and held up a laminated rectangle with shaking hands. I let him in, sealed the door, welded it again while he drank water in slow sips the way someone does when their body is close to shutting down. Orin changed the dynamic of the bay in ways I hadn't predicted. He was young but sharp, and his electrical training made him genuinely useful. Within 2 days, he'd traced the emergency power line I'd tapped into and identified its source, not a generator, he said, but a battery system deeper in the infrastructure. Massive lead-acid cells installed in the 60s, designed to hold charge for years, but not indefinitely. He estimated they had weeks of capacity left at our current draw, not months. That gave us a timeline, one we hadn't had before. He also brought information. He'd moved through more of the tunnel system than I had, in the dark, for days. He'd encountered the infected at closer range. He described them in a way that matched what I'd heard, but not seen people whose nervous systems seemed to have been rewired. They didn't hunt by sight, he said. They reacted to sound primarily, and to something else he couldn't define. Maybe vibration. Maybe scent. They were dormant for long periods, sometimes standing in the same spot for hours, then suddenly activating with no apparent trigger. "There's something else," he told me on his second night in the bay. We were sharing a can of soup heated on a makeshift burner. "They gather." I asked what he meant. In the bigger spaces, the station platforms, the junctions where multiple lines converge, I found maybe 30 of them in one place, Cortlandt Street. They were just standing there in the dark, not moving, not making sound, like they were waiting for something. That image settled into my mind like a stone dropping into water. 30 of them, standing in the dark, waiting. Waiting for what? He shook his head. I don't know. But I moved through there as quiet as I've ever been in my life. And they didn't react. Not one of them. Over the following days, Orin and I established a working partnership. He was good with systems better than me, honestly. Despite his years of experience being a fraction of mine, he thought in terms of circuits and pathways, which translated well to the tunnel infrastructure. He mapped the power connections, identified which ventilation shafts we could safely access for air quality assessment, and rigged a system to monitor the sealed doors for vibration that might indicate something pressing against them. I handled the strategic planning, route mapping for supply runs, rationing schedules, perimeter maintenance. We fell into complementary roles with surprising ease. But on day 16, 5 days after Orin arrived, something changed. I woke in the early hours to find his cot empty. This wasn't unusual. Neither of us slept well, and we'd developed a habit of wandering the bay's corridors when insomnia hit. But I found him in the tool room, standing in front of the electrical panel he'd been tracing. And he was doing something I didn't understand. He was pressing his ear against the wall, not leaning casually, but pressing hard. His palm flat against the concrete beside his head, as if trying to feel something through the 3 feet of reinforced material. Orin. He didn't startle. He turned slowly, and in the fluorescent light, his face had an expression I can only describe as concentrated listening. "There's something below us," he said. "Below us is bedrock and utility conduit." "No, below that. I can feel it through the wall. A vibration. Low frequency. Started maybe an hour ago." I pressed my own hand to the wall. I felt nothing except cold concrete. But Orin's hearing was sharper than mine, 20 years younger. No decades of tunnel machinery wearing at his eardrums. I didn't dismiss it. "What kind of vibration?" "Pulsing, regular, like a heartbeat, but slower." He pulled away from the wall. "It might be machinery, something running deep in the infrastructure that we haven't identified." I wanted it to be machinery. I wanted it to be a pump or a transformer or some forgotten piece of Cold War engineering humming along in a sub-basement we'd never reach. But something about the way he said heartbeat lodged in my brain and wouldn't leave. We monitored it over the next 2 days. Orin built a crude contact microphone from scavenged parts, a piezoelectric element from a lighter pressed against the floor with tape and wired into an earpiece. Through it, I could finally hear what he'd felt. A low thrumming, almost below the range of hearing, regular, organic sounding in a way I couldn't justify with engineering knowledge. And it was getting stronger. On day 18, Orin said something that reframed everything. "Garrett, what if the gathering isn't random?" We were eating crackers in the main chamber, our routine dinner under the steady fluorescent lights that now felt less like safety and more like a signal. "What do you mean?" "The ones I saw at Cortlandt Street, standing together, dormant, grouped. What if they're not waiting? What if they're listening? Same way I was listening through the wall." I put down my cracker. "Listening to what?" "To this." He pointed at the floor. "Whatever this vibration is, what if it's some kind of signal? What if it's coordinating them?" The thought was horrifying, not because it was implausible, but because it suddenly explained patterns I'd noticed in my sound log. The waves of activity I'd documented, they'd been roughly regular. Every 6 to 8 hours, increased movement in the surrounding tunnels. Between waves, near total stillness, like something was pulsing, triggering them, then letting them rest. And if that was true, then we weren't just hiding in a sealed space. We were sitting on top of whatever was doing the pulsing, or directly adjacent to it, or worst case, inside its range. We need to find the source, Orin said. No, we need to stay sealed. Garrett, if that thing is broadcasting, and if it's what makes them gather, then every day we stay here, more of them collect in the tunnels around us. You've heard it yourself, more movement every night, more sound. They're not leaving. They're coming closer, toward this. He was right. I'd been tracking it in my log without wanting to name the trend. Night movement was increasing. The sounds against the sealed doors were more frequent. Something was drawing them toward this section of the tunnel. I didn't sleep that night. I lay on my cot and listened to the faint thrumming through the floors, so low it was more felt than heard. A pulse that seemed to sync with my heartbeat if I lay still long enough, which was maybe the most disturbing thing of all. On day 19, I agreed to Orin's plan, not to find the source that was beyond our capability, but to scout a route out. If the gathering was intensifying around us, our sealed shelter was becoming a trap. We needed to identify an escape path before the tunnel density made movement impossible. Orin had studied the system maps I had pinned to the break room wall. He identified a service tunnel that branched off the main line approximately 300 yards east of our bay. It ran parallel to the river, originally built for utility access, and connected to a ventilation shaft that surfaced in a park near the South Street seaport. If that shaft was clear, it was our exit. We prepared for 2 days, gathered supplies, checked equipment, charged our headlamps from the dwindling battery system. I welded shut every door in the bay except the primary blast door if we were leaving. Nothing that came after us would find an easy entrance. On the day 21, we opened the blast door. The tunnel was different. Not in any way I could see at first. Same concrete walls, same rail lines, same cable trays overhead. But the smell had intensified enormously. That organic chemical mixture was now thick enough to taste. And underneath it was something new. A dampness. The walls glistened slightly in our headlamp beams, coated with something that wasn't water. And the sound. Even through the door, we'd heard increased activity. But out here, in the open tunnel, it was layered. Multiple sources. Breathing, shuffling, the wet rattle from dozens of damaged throats. Not close, the sounds bounced and distorted in the tunnel acoustics, but surrounding us. Above on the platforms, ahead in the junctions. Behind us, somewhere in the dark. We moved east, slowly. Headlamps on the lowest setting to reduce visible range while preserving our own sight. Orin went first. His hearing was better, and he moved with a quietness that impressed me. I followed 5 feet behind, watching our rear. The service tunnel junction was where the map said it would be. A steel door marked ST-E-14 in faded yellow paint. I had the key. It turned smoothly. Someone had maintained this one, or the dry conditions had preserved the mechanism. Beyond was narrower. A single-track width passage with lower ceilings, utility pipes running along one wall, the floor cleaner than the main tunnel. No slime on the walls. The air was slightly better, and crucially, quiet. The sounds from the main tunnel faded as we moved into the service passage, the junction acting as a natural acoustic break. We walked for maybe 10 minutes before Orin stopped. He held up his fist, the universal halt signal, and I froze. Then I heard it too. Voices, ahead of us. Multiple voices. Human, speaking in normal tones, having what sounded like a conversation. Orin looked back at me. In the beam of his headlamp, I could see the conflict on his face, hope and suspicion fighting each other. We moved forward slowly until the passage opened into a wider space. Some kind of utility hub, a room maybe 40 feet across, with multiple pipe junctions converging overhead, and a raised platform along one wall. Emergency lighting here was working, casting a dim yellowish glow over everything. There were people. 7 of them. They'd set up a camp of sorts on the raised platforms, sleeping bags, bottled water, a camp stove, what looked like military MRE wrappers scattered around. A woman was speaking to a man in low tones. 2 others were sleeping. 3 more sat in a loose circle, eating. The woman saw us first. She stood abruptly, and the motion triggered everyone else to alertness. 2 of the men had weapons, not guns, but a fire axe and a length of pipe. "Stop there," the woman said. She was maybe 40, short dark hair, wearing what looked like hospital scrubs under a coat. Her voice was controlled but carried an authority that said she was the one making decisions in this group. "We're clean," I said. My hands were visible, my wrench tucked into my belt. "I'm transit maintenance. My name is Garrett. This is Orin." "How long since you were topside?" 21 days. I've been sealed in the maintenance bay at Fulton since the first afternoon." She studied us. Then, "I'm Dr. Lenore Abadi. I was at New York Downtown Hospital when it fell. These people are who I managed to get out." I'd learned their stories over the next hour. Lenore had been working the emergency room when the first infected were brought in. She'd recognized faster than most that what she was seeing wasn't a standard pathological response. She'd gotten 6 people out through a basement tunnel, patients, staff, a security guard, and they'd been moving through the subsurface infrastructure for 2 weeks. They had information we didn't. They'd seen the infected up close, in clinical lighting, while they were still transitioning. Lenore described it with medical precision. An initial fever, then a period of apparent recovery, 12 to 18 hours, where the person seemed normal but was slightly disoriented, like mild concussion. Then rapid deterioration of higher cognitive function over about 6 hours, followed by the full change. "The important thing," she said, looking directly at me, "is the middle stage, the false recovery. We lost 2 people because of it. They seemed fine. They said they felt fine. And then they weren't." I looked at Orin. He was listening with fixed attention, but said nothing. I thought about the 11 days he'd spent in the tunnels before reaching me. I thought about how easily he'd adapted, how useful he'd been, how rational and competent. And then I thought about the wall. His ear against the concrete, the vibration he heard before I could. "How do you confirm someone's clean?" I asked Lenore. "Time. 24 hours minimum from potential exposure, ideally 48. Track any disorientation, any unusual sensitivity to light or sound. Any moment where they seem to lose focus and then snap back. Those are the markers." I didn't look at Orin again, but I felt him looking at me. That night, camped with Lenore's group in the utility hub, I pulled Orin aside during a quiet moment. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be straight with me." He nodded. His face was steady, but I could see tension in his jaw. "The vibration, the one you can hear through the floor, can you still hear it?" He was silent for a long time, and then, "Yeah, louder now. In here it's louder. Can anyone else hear it?" He looked at the others, then back at me. "I don't think so. They haven't mentioned it." Something cold settled in my gut. What about the other things Lenore mentioned? Disorientation, unusual sensitivity. Garrett, I let you in, into a sealed space, on faith. I need you to be honest with me. His hands were trembling slightly. Not the shaking of dehydration this time. Something else. I think something's different about me, he said quietly. Since the stairwell, when my supervisor was attacked. I got some of it on me. On my hands. I washed it off immediately, but... He trailed off, swallowed. I should have told you. The world contracted to the space between us. This man I'd lived beside for 10 days, who I'd shared food with, worked beside, built systems with, who I'd let into my sealed shelter because I couldn't bear the silence anymore. Are you changing? He met my eyes. I don't think so. I don't feel different in my mind. But I can hear things. Things no one else hears. And sometimes I know where they are. The infected. I can feel where they're gathered, like a pressure in my head pointing toward them. I believed him, about not feeling different in his mind. His eyes were clear, his speech was normal, his behavior had been rational and cooperative. But Lenore's description of the middle stage played on a loop in my thoughts seemed normal. Said they felt fine. We need to tell Lenore. His face went rigid. She'll want to isolate me, or worse. She's a doctor. She might understand what... Garrett. I watched a doctor try to restrain one of these things on the second day. It killed her in about 4 seconds. Medical knowledge doesn't make people generous with risk. He was right. I knew he was right. But I also knew that every hour I kept this secret, I was making the same choice for 7 other people without their consent. Give me time, Orin said. 24 hours. If anything changes, if I feel anything different, I'll tell them myself. I'll isolate willingly. But right now I'm functional and I might be useful. I can hear them. I can tell you where they are. That's an advantage. 24 hours. I thought of Celia. I thought of the birdhouse roof I never sanded. I thought of all the unfinished things that pile up when you keep telling yourself there's time. 12 hours, I said. Then we tell her regardless. He accepted. In those 12 hours, Orin proved his value in a way that complicated everything. Lenore's group had been planning to reach the ventilation shaft. I'd identified the same exit we'd been heading toward, but they'd been stalled because they couldn't determine the density of infected between their position and the shaft entrance. Orin closed his eyes, pressed his palms against the floor, and after 2 minutes of silence said, 14, maybe 16, between here and the shaft junction. Most of them dormant right now. But there's a cluster at the shaft base. 6 or 7, active. Lenore watched him do this with an expression I couldn't read. How do you know that? I intervened before Orin could answer. He has very sensitive hearing. He's been mapping their positions by sound for weeks. Not a lie, exactly. An omission. She accepted it, or appeared to. But her eyes returned to Orin repeatedly over the next hour with a professional attention that suggested she was already running diagnostics in her mind. We planned our movement for 6 hours later, timing it to coincide with one of the dormant periods Orin described. The shaft was our exit. If it was clear at the top, we'd surface. If not, we'd need another plan. The group moved as a unit. Lenore at the center with the 2 people who couldn't move fast, an older man with a bad knee, and a woman who hadn't spoken since Lenore pulled her from the hospital. Orin at the front, me at the rear. The others filled in around us. Orin navigated us with uncanny precision. Twice he stopped and redirected us through side passages to avoid concentrations only he could detect. Once he said, "Wait," and we all froze for 11 minutes until he nodded and moved forward again, whatever he'd sensed apparently having passed. We reached the shaft base in 90 minutes. And there, as Orin had said, the cluster was waiting. We couldn't see them. The shaft was around a corner, the passage dark beyond our headlamp's reach. But we could hear them, that same breathing. Multiple sets of lungs working in damaged rhythm, echoing up the metal shaft. "Can we draw them away?" Lenore whispered. Orin shook his head. "They're not responding to sound right now. They're in the deep, dormant state. Even a loud noise might not move them. Then what triggers them out of it?" He hesitated. I saw it. A flicker across his face that wasn't fear, it was recognition. Like he knew the answer, but didn't want to say it. "The pulse," he said finally. "When the next vibration cycle hits, they'll activate and move. If we can get into the shaft before that happens and climb fast enough." "When's the next cycle?" He pressed his palm to the wall, closed his eyes. 40 minutes, maybe less." Lenore made the call. "Then we go now. Clear them if we can. Get into the shaft and climb before the pulse hits." What happened next was fast and ugly. The man with the fire axe, his name was Desmond, former hospital security, went around the corner with his weapon and 2 of the others. I heard impacts, wet sounds, the specific noise of something heavy hitting flesh that doesn't respond the way living flesh should. It wasn't combat. It was more like clearing fallen timber, methodical, grim work against bodies that didn't fight back because they weren't awake. 6 of them. Desmond and the others put them down in about 3 minutes. When I came around the corner with the group, the floor was slick and the shaft entrance was clear. A vertical climb, metal rungs set into concrete, rising maybe 80 feet to a grated hatch at the top. "Go," Lenore said. She sent the weaker members first, then the others. Orin and I were last. He paused at the base of the ladder and looked back down the passage. His face was drawn, and in the light, I could see something I hadn't noticed before, a thin tracery of lines along his temples. Like veins, but darker, almost purple. "Orin." He turned to me. "I can feel it building. The next pulse. It's coming faster than I thought." "Then climb." He grabbed the rungs and went up. I followed. 80 feet of vertical climbing with a wrench on my belt and the sound of my own ragged breathing echoing in the metal shaft. Above me, the others were scrambling toward the grate. Below me, silence. And then, distantly, that thrumming. Growing. Building like pressure behind a dam. This is the part of the story that still wakes me up, wherever I'm telling it from. If this is keeping you up at night, drop a comment and tell me where you're listening now. Let me finish. Orin stopped climbing. 10 feet above me, he just stopped. His hands locked on the rungs and his body went rigid. "Orin, move." "I can feel all of them," he whispered. His voice had changed, not damaged, not the broken rattle of the infected, but deeper, resonant, as if the shaft itself was amplifying it. "Hundreds, in the tunnels below us. They're all waking up right now." I could hear it too. Not the way he heard it, but through the shaft walls, a rising sound from below. Movement. Dozens, hundreds of shuffling footsteps, the rustle of bodies that had been still for hours suddenly activating in concert. A wave of motion triggered by the pulse that was now a physical pressure in my bones. "Orin, you have to climb, now!" He looked down at me. In the faint light leaking from above, his eyes were wrong. Not fully. Not the dead emptiness I'd seen in emergency broadcasts. But the pupils were too large, and something behind them was calculating in a way that wasn't entirely Orin anymore. "If I go up," he said very clearly, "it follows me. They follow it. The pulse. I can feel it anchored in me now. If I go up there with those people." He didn't finish. He didn't need to. "Garrett, close the hatch behind you. Tell Lenore." "No. You don't get to say no. This isn't your choice." His voice hardened, then softened. "You let me in when you didn't have to. That meant something. Now I'm telling you to go and let me handle this." Sounds below us. Getting louder. The shaft amplified everything I could hear them entering the passage at the bottom, drawn toward us. Toward him. I climbed. I climbed past Orin with my shoulder brushing his frozen form on the rungs, and I didn't look down again. When I reached the grate, hands from above grabbed my arms and hauled me through. Daylight, the first natural light I'd seen in 21 days, hit me like a physical blow. October sky, gray, wind carrying rain. The park was empty, the city visible in the distance, smoke rising from multiple points, but standing, still standing. "Close it," I said. My voice didn't sound like mine. "Close the hatch and seal it." Desmond and another man slammed the grate down. Below, in the shaft, I could hear Orin descending, going back down, going toward the sound of hundreds of waking dead, rising toward whatever signal was anchored in his body. Lenore was staring at me. "What happened?" I told her. All of it. The exposure, the hearing, the vibration. What he could do and what he'd become. She listened without expression, and when I finished, she closed her eyes for a long time and then opened them. He pulled them toward himself, deliberately. Yes, he might have saved this entire area. If they follow that signal down, deeper into the tunnels, away from the surface. I know. We stood there in the gray October light, 10 people alive above ground. And below us, a man I'd trusted and doubted and trusted again was walking into the dark with every dead thing in Lower Manhattan following the pulse in his bones. I never heard the birdhouse came up again. Celia was alive. I found out 3 weeks later through a refugee coordination center in Jersey City. She'd made it out over the Triborough before it was closed. She asked about the birdhouse in her first letter, whether I'd ever finished sanding the roof. I wrote back and said I hadn't. That some things stay unfinished, and you have to decide if that's a failure, or just the shape of how life actually works. I don't know what happened to Orin, whether the signal consumed him completely or whether some part of him stayed conscious as he led them deeper. I don't know if what he did was sacrifice or just the inevitable endpoint of something that started in a stairwell on Church Street when his supervisor's blood touched his hands. What I know is this: I let him in. When everything in my training said keep it sealed, verify first, trust no one, you can't confirm, I opened that door because 11 days of silence was killing something in me that mattered more than safety. And because of that, 7 people climbed out of a shaft into daylight, who otherwise would have died in a utility hub when the pulse brought every infected body in the tunnel system converging on their position. The subway tunnel was my shelter. For 21 days, it kept me alive. But a shelter isn't a life. It's just a pause between the moment everything falls apart and the moment you decide whether you're going to do something about it. I chose to open the door. I live with that every single day.